Let's create a simple function which will give us the currently logged in user. I'll call it the getCurrentUser function. First, let's create a current user variable and initialize it to none. Notice that I appended the underscore. This is because I want to differentiate between the variable local to this function scope and the global variable we're going to create soon. Now we can check if the user ID exists in the user's cookie session. If it does, let's get the user from the database. If the user exists, put that user inside of the current user variable. We can return that variable at the end. Before we do that, I want to check if the current user variable is none. If it is, that means that one of these conditions was not true, which means that the user is not logged in. In that case, let's assign an empty user instance to the current user variable. This instance will not be saved inside of the database, but it will pose as an anonymous user. We need this because we will use all kinds of methods on the current user instance. You cannot use these methods on nothing, and this would happen if we just return none, so the result of this would be a potential server error. Okay, now we can use this function to get the current user in the view. For example, let me replace this logged in user with the current user variable. This variable will use the getCurrentUser function to check if the user is logged in. Don't forget to import the function from the auth package. Pass it to the template and let's check the result. Everything looks good, which means that our function works. This is okay, but we now need to call this function in every view that needs the current user, which is not much of an improvement. Remember the context globals we mentioned in the previous lesson? Well, you can also make your own by using the Factoids local class. Don't be confused because I call them context globals and context locals. It depends on the perspective. Flask will call these variables global because they are available anywhere inside of the application context. However, they are actually context locals because they are local to the current context, the current request cycle if you will. We're not going to use the local class here because our current user variable depends on the result of a function we created. Instead, I will import the local proxy class. This class will let us define the context variable which will always run the function we give it as a parameter. So every time someone tries to access the current user global variable, this function will be executed and the result will be saved inside of the proxy. Lambda will be familiar if you ever did some functional programming in Python or otherwise. It is just an anonymous function which will run our own getCurrentUser function. Now let's import the context variable inside of the main views file. This local proxy current user is now also available here, and this is not a problem because the main blueprint is registered in the same application, which means that it runs in the same application context. Let's refresh the page again to see if it works. No server errors, which means that we successfully created a context local variable. Great, but not too great. The current user is now available in every view, but we'll still always need to pass it to the templates. If you want to pass something to every template inside of the blueprint, you can use the context processor decorator. Context processor runs before the template is rendered and injects some values into the template context. Every template has its own context, and that context will contain all of the variables you pass to the render template function, like we did with the logged in user here. If you want something to be passed to every template, you can use the context processor, which decorates a function that needs to return a dictionary. This dictionary will be injected to the templates just like the key value pairs you pass to the render template function. We'll inject the current user variable, which will be initialized from the getCurrentUser function, just like our local proxy. Since I want to have this in all of the application templates and not just in this blueprint, I will add the app prefix to the context processor decorator. This will inject the dictionary to all of the templates in the application. That means that we don't need to pass this current user proxy to the home template anymore, so let's delete it. Now we can implement two functions inside of the user model to check if the user is authenticated or not. isAuthenticate method will return true if the user has a username. Remember that we are returning an empty user instance inside of the getCurrentUser function. This happens if the user is not logged in. That empty instance has no username, so if the current user variable doesn't have a username, that means that the user is not authenticated. We can also make the opposite function, which will check if the user is anonymous. User will be anonymous if it doesn't have a username. Now we can finally remove these session references. Instead of checking if the user is logged in like this, let's use the current user proxy inside of the logout view. If the user is anonymous, that means that he is not logged in. Let's change the home template too. Instead of checking the session, we can check if the user is authenticated. Instead of using the logged in user variable, let's use the current user variable we injected with the context processor. Let me also change the condition inside of the base template navigation bar to check if the user is authenticated instead. I'll add another link to the logged in user which will later lead to the user's account, but for now it's just an empty link. The link will also write out the current user's username taken from the current user variable. We can now do that since variable is available in every template. This approach may work, but it is far from optimal. For example, check out this home template. We are using the current user variable 4 times here. 6 if we count the references inside of the navigation bar too. This means that this variable will call the getCurrentUser function 6 times just for this one template. This function will see that the session exists and it will take the user from the database. But it will do it 6 times. That is 6 calls to the database. Now imagine a big website where each user will make a call to the database 6 times just by loading one page. This is a waste of resources, and imagine if we also needed the variable inside of the view code. The local proxy would then also do another call to the database. Instead, let's optimize this function. Remember the gContext global we mentioned before. We can attach properties to this object and that information will be available to us in the current request context. Instead of just assigning this user to the current user, let's also send it to the gCurrentUser property. This property doesn't exist on the gObject by default, but it will when we assign it like this. Instead of initializing this variable to none, let's initialize it to gCurrentUser. I will change the condition to also check if the current user variable is none. Let's see how this works with the diagram. Imagine that the request comes in and the application context appears. Inside of it, we have the gglobal variable. We need the current user, so the local proxy calls our function. It first checks if the gCurrentUser property has a logged in user. This is the first time that the function is executed in this request lifetime, so of course it doesn't. So the current user variable is none. This condition checks out and we get the user from the database. This user gets assigned to the current user but also to the gCurrentUser property. The current user is not none, so we can pass this condition and return the user. Now see what happens when we need the current user proxy the second time in the request cycle. The proxy will again call the function, but this time the gCurrentUser property is not empty. Both these conditionals are now false, so we just return the current user taken from the gObject. Do you see the advantage here? The function is optimized because it will get the user from the database only the first time. Every other call to the function in the current application context will just take the user from the gObject instead of making another call to the database. In computer science, this technique is called memoization. One more thing we need to fix here is this first call to the current user property. Remember, this property won't exist on the gObject until we assign it the first time here, so this assignment will throw an error. Instead of calling it like this, use the getAttribute function. Now if the property doesn't exist, it will return none instead of an error. And that is it. We just implemented a current user variable which is available in all of the views and templates. Of course, we need to import the local proxy current user if we want to use it in other blueprints, but that is not a problem. If something wasn't clear enough, don't hesitate to ask a question in the discussion. Okay, when you're ready, check out the next lesson on cookies.